one could spend a lifetime studying just the Responsa, just the halachic literature that was produced in what's today, in the boundaries of today's Ukraine. Now, it's important to know that when we think about this in historical terms, Ukraine as an independent country is relatively young. It's it gained its independence most recently in 1991, though there were several short periods earlier in which there was an independent Ukrainian polity. When we talk about the lands that we're going to be discussing tonight, we mainly think of this as Poland. Of course, the boundaries of Poland was a major world power until, from the 14th century, it began its rise through the 16th and into the 17th century, when it began its decline and it was finally partitioned. It was carved up by the three of the great European empires of the day: the Russian Empire, the Prussian Empire, and the Austrian Empire, which made Poland and most of what's today the Ukraine part of those empires. The eastern part of the Ukraine there's not a lot in terms of the Responsa literature. It was not heavily settled until the latter part of the 19th century, and I don't mean heavily settled by Jews, heavily settled by anyone. It was controlled by Turks, various Turkic tribes under Ottoman suzerainty until the late 18th century. So that's a little bit of the geographical and historical background. But when we get into it, we'll see that it's not terribly confusing. It just requires a little bit of orientation. I chose several Responsa from different centuries, starting from the mid-17th century and continuing till the early 20th century. And the goal here, I don't know how much of this we're going to get to, meaning I don't think we're going to be able to learn all of the material that I have prepared, and that's okay. But what I do want to do is demonstrate how through the Responsa literature, well, two things are going on, right? One is what's called Responsa as a source of history, which is a general trend that we've seen in the study of Responsa over the past century or more, that the Responsa literature, she'elot u'tshuvot, the questions that rabbis are asked about individual specific cases, can shed light on history, but there's also what I call the inverse of that, what I call history as a source of Responsa, that it's only by understanding the history, it's only by understanding what's going on in the world around the context, the historical context of the responsum, that we can really appreciate what's going on in the responsum and what are the dilemmas and challenges that the meshivim, that the particular rabbis who are responding to these questions are facing. Okay, so you should have a source sheet in front of you called Ukrainian Responsa. I will share it as well. Okay, this first set of sources, it's 4 consecutive Responsa in a work called She'elot u'tshuvot Eitan HaEzrachi. It was penned by Rabbi Avraham Rappaport, who was the chief rabbi in Lviv, or Lemberg, which was when we talk about Lemberg or Lviv, we're talking about a place that was a major center of Jewish learning for almost half a millennium. It rose to prominence in the 1500s and it remained there. Even some of the decisors that we're going to see later today were still, even into the 20th century, were living in Lviv. And Lviv was also a major a major Jewish population center and cultural center. One of the rabbis of Lviv, and who originally there was a thought that we were going to discuss him tonight, was actually the teacher of Rabbi Avraham Rappaport, and that is Rabbi Yehoshua Falk Katz, who was the author of the commentary on the Torah known as the Drisha. So that's something that's the city of Lvov and the institution of Drisha are connected at the hip. They share a name. This Rabbi Yoshua Falk also wrote another commentary on the Torah called Prisha, and he wrote a commentary on Shulchan Aruch called Mi'irat Einayim, or the Sma. It was one of the first of the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, and really helped make the Shulchan Aruch what it became. Helped standardize the Shulchan Aruch as sort of the centerpiece of the Jewish legal curriculum. So this was a student of his who was a rabbi, one of the rabbis in Lviv in the early part of the 17th century. Now, Lviv was actually two communities. There was an inner city and there was an outer city. And sometimes you'll see in the Responsa that it was saying that this is the rabbi of the inner city, and somebody else that's responding or somebody else that's writing is writing from the outer city. They were distinct communities. But here, what you have is, okay, you have a particular case. Now, interestingly enough, we're going to look at, this is a series of 4 responses that deal with a murder, a case of murder in the city of Monastrich. Now, I sent a link to a map. I'm going to toggle back and forth here so that we can see where these places are on a map of the contemporary Ukraine. So if you don't have that link in front of you, I will share that now. Okay, here, where the little gun icon is, that's where the murder took place, Monastritska in Ternopil Oblast. And the Jewish star that you see here, the Magen David, that's Lviv. Okay, these other places are places that are going to come up. And you can see already now that we're talking about the eastern part, but a good chunk of the eastern part of today's Ukraine. Okay, back to the text itself. So the Rabbi David Segel Ashkenazi, who's the rabbi of Monastrich, he writes a letter to Lviv saying, I have a dilemma. I don't know what to do. And he says, Hine l'shalom mar li mar. I don't know if we're not gonna read every single word here. What happened was a man committed murder. A man had a quarrel with another man. It came to blows, and the perpetrator, he says he ka'oto psaim v'achar kach kamalav, meaning he beat him. Achar kach kamalav be'etz hara'oi laharogbo, and then he came with a piece of wood, with a club that is a murder weapon, a weapon that one can commit murder with. V'hargo Rahman al-Itzlan, and he killed the guy. God save us. Al-Atar, right there. Nobody else was involved. It was late at night. The only 2 witnesses were minors. They were the son and daughter of a victim. But this son and daughter, they raised they started crying, as we can expect. The daughter ran away. The son tried to stand up for his father, and the son was also beaten. And because of the noise, right, and look at the bolded section here, because of they raised such a hue and cry in the city, bo arelim, right, uncircumcised men, right, meaning non-Jewish men, they ran to see what was going on. A lot of people came. And they ran after the perpetrator. He says that they found him at Harodev al yedei ha'arelim v'hagole hadam lahavdil, right? Both the uncircumcised, the non-Jews, and the avengers, the blood avengers, meaning relatives of the victims. And he puts in lahavdil, right? So that's something that we'll make a note of that when you mention that this writer, when he mentions Jews and Gentiles in the same sentence, he puts in a lahavdil. And then he continues, oile einayim shekakro, oh, this is terrible. This is awful news. And now what's going on is that the perpetrator is in jail, b'mishmar ha'arelim. He's in the non-Jewish, the Gentile jail, the uncircumcised jail. The lahavdil the hagoel hadam b'shmira me'ula ba'oven shelo nitan lo makom klal pleta. He can't go anywhere. He's not going anywhere. Now he wants to know, what should we do to this guy? And he raises several possibilities. He says, first of all, this guy, it was muzakmu for samlanu li'ish ra'u b'liyal. This guy has a reputation. This guy had already established a pattern that he's a terrible person. Uroa ma'alalim. I'll give you an example. It says last year he beat his wife and people thought that she was going to die. She was bedridden for a long time. Everybody thought that she was actually going to die. And what did they do? The Beis Din, the local rabbinical court, wanted to bring him to justice. But he said, but what did this perpetrator do? He went to the other side. Now it's talking about a street. He went to the other side of the street, meaning he went to the side of the street where the church is. But of course, the term sitra achara can also mean, in Kabbalistic terminology and also in general terminology, we get the other side, right? The side of evil, or the side of Satan. And that's the side of the street, the side of Tumah, the side of impurity. Beit Avodah Zarah mamash. There was a church there, meaning, and the shamash, the person, the emissary of the court, said, "What are you doing there?" And he says, "Well, for a long time I've been contemplating conversion to Christianity, and I think I'm going to go to the priest." And when the shamash heard this, he said, "Oh, no, we don't want you to do that." So he said, "Okay, this is what you have to do. These are the penances that you have to do in order to be reaccepted in our community," because they were afraid that if he would go to the Gentiles, then he would get the entire community in trouble. Yarenu mipanav. But in secret, we said to the shamash that he shouldn't be allowed into the shul, mikol davar shebekadusha, and to participate in anything that requires kedusha, meaning he can't daven for the yamud, he can't get an aliyah, etc. So it sounds like not such a terrible penalty for somebody who did a really terrible thing. But now he went and did it again, and this time he actually killed somebody. So now he's asking, can we cause his death? Right? Can we cause him to die? Because I think, we, the people of Monastrica, think that if we wanted to, we could probably bribe officials and get him released. Because the tendency of the non-Jews here are not to kill him. Right? They're not going to kill him. And if they don't kill him, and if he then instead accepts Christianity, then it'll be terrible. So the question is, can we cause him to die? Meaning, of the three options, one is that he's not going to die and he's going to be, and he'll convert to Christianity. Two is they'll actually put him to death. Well, we'll see. The third one hasn't come up yet. We would see. It seems that we would prefer that he be put to death. So that's the question. The first response comes from Rav Yosef Getz, who was one of the rabbis of Lviv. He says, I was asked about this ugly thing that happened. And he starts by quoting a Gemara, and it's a fairly well-known Gemara that says that Beitin makin ve'onshin v'chulei, that Beit Din can strike someone and punish someone, and then he leaves a v'chulei, meaning these are works. And even in the earlier response, we saw that there were certain things that were somewhat coy, right? Even the word like sitra achara, that you don't say exactly what you mean, because these things were all, these things were all read by Christians, and you had to write in a way that wasn't going to get you into trouble. Shebeitin makin v'onshin v'chulei. He puts in that v'chulei. The rest of the line is shalom in hadin, that there could be extrajudicial punishment at the courts, seemingly at the courts discretion of the court. And they give an example of somebody that was riding his horse on Shabbat in the days of the Greeks, and they brought him to Beit Din and they stoned him to death. Not because he was deserving of death, but that was because that was needed at that time. And so he quotes several of the Rishonim that deal with this. And he concludes that if we're talking about somebody, if somebody committed a crime that's punishable by death according to the Torah, even though nowadays we don't actually have the power to put people to death, even though we can't convene a Sanhedrin, if it's necessary, if the generation needs it, we can't take measures to destroy this person, to eliminate this person from the world. And then he qualifies that. In this, it had to be a case, for example, where if due process were possible, we'd be able to put him to death. But in here, there were no witnesses. At the same time, we know exactly what his intentions were. We know that he planned this. We know that this was premeditated murder. So he compares it to a case where there's overwhelming circumstantial evidence. So if we take that and we include all the things that he did beforehand, meaning we know what his reputation was, and the fact that he is at least flirting with conversion to Christianity, so he's in the category of moridin velo ma'alin, somebody that you lower them into the pit and you don't rescue them from the pit, meaning you indirectly put the person to death. And he says that even those who would be against that, that's only the ones who are against it would only be against it if a Jew is actually putting him to death. But this person who's already arrested by Gentiles, everybody agrees we don't have to save him. His father-in-law was the Maharam Lublin, a rabbinic authority from the previous generation, from the late 1500s. So if you include everything in the early 1600s, if you include what Maharam Lublin wrote about this, that if we come and we actually ransom this murderer, we bribe someone to let this murderer go, that would be a tremendous chilul Hashem. Tov sheyad Yisrael lo yiyebo. So the best thing to happen is that Jews don't take action against him directly. V'yavur min ha'olam al yedei ha'akum. Let the non-Jews eliminate him. Let them kill him. Al yedei zeh yigdoru pirtzot b'nei Yisrael. That will shore up the the boundaries of of our own society. It kadesh shem shamayim. It will actually be a kiddush Hashem. V'chol Yisrael yiyu nekiyim, and we will all be innocent. We will not actually have to shed blood. So he thinks this is a very elegant solution to put this man to death through the hands of the non-Jews. And he actually signs in the first print edition, the word zot is highlighted, which actually gives us a year. That's tough chet. So this is really just before the things got, just before the uprising in the Ukraine, and that's the year 1648. So 1648 in Lvov, Rav Yosef ben Eliakim Getz writes that, let the Gentiles put him to death. Rav Meir Zak, another rabbi, the same time in Lvov, Lemberg, writes similarly, but he actually goes in a different direction slightly. He thinks of, we saw this a little bit with Rav Yosef Getz, but here we see more that he's more concerned with public policy. Meaning it's not that he's not concerned with halakhah, but he's looking at halakhah through a policy lens. So he says, look, we know that nowadays we don't put people to death. There are no daled mitot beit din. But we have this principle of makin va'onshin shalom in hadin, right? That beit din can administer punishment when the need arises. But then he says, but what is the need, or what does it mean that the need arises? It has to be a case of migdar milta. Migdar milta literally means to build a fence around the matter, meaning there's been a breach, right? There's been some sort of communal norm that has been breached. And now we need limigdar milta. We need to rebuild the fence. We need to shore up our society so that it continues on the straight and narrow. So he says, what are the parameters of that application? What does it mean that only in a case of migdar milta? So he says, we need to think about this. The halacha is that you're allowed to do it if it's migdar milta. He says, tzarich iu mahu migdar milta. We need to investigate what is migdar milta. And then he says what it doesn't mean. And what he says it doesn't mean is probably what we would call the slippery slope argument. He says, Morgal b'fi hamona am, you hear most people saying, V'im af b'ktzat, meaning the hamon am, the masses say, V'im af b'ktzat lomdim, even some people who have learned a little bit, some, somewhat learned people, upashur be'einehem, and it's so simple to them, she'omrim b'feirush migdar milta lehaba, that we need to prevent a breach from happening in the future. It's not that there's a breach now, but that if we let this go, then it will cause a broader erosion of society. She'im lo yadunu hachote, if they don't condemn this sinner, as rabim hamid partzim ibnei amenu, then many of our fellow Jews, of our people, will follow their lead. Right? Nothing is going to happen to me, even if I do whatever I please. That's what they're going to see, that this guy got away with it, so we can all get away with it. But then he continues, no, and he says that's not what migdar milta is. If you look at the Rishonim and Achronim, it's not what they said. Elakatvu migdar milta shu kasher roin sha'am prutzim ba'areot obishar averut bahador parutz. There's already been a breach. There has already been the social norm has already broken down. There's already been it's already a situation where we need to do something drastic in order to restore things to the way they were, because things have already gone off the rails. And he says, and you've got to be, and he says that basically you have to be a social scientist in order to know this. You have to know what the practice is. You have to know what people are doing. All the wise people of the city have to get together and really look into it. You can't just throw around the word migdar milta and use that for anything that you want. And he says that the truth of the matter is, and I skipped this earlier, otherwise you can say migdar milta about anything. Oh, somebody jaywalked, migdar milta, we need to crack some skulls. Somebody did something that we would consider a minor offense. No, the punishment has to be really harsh, because we don't want society as a whole to go down that slippery slope. And he's saying, no, it doesn't work as a slippery slope. You can't kill somebody because of some kind of real or imagined slippery slope. It can only be if there's already a breach, if there's a norm that the community has already started to, show a pattern of non-observance or a pattern of violation. So now he says, okay, so let's look at our case. Is this act of violence, is this act that this guy killed someone, is that a broader societal problem or not? And he says, "V'nir ele et kazot." I think, ba'avotenu harabim, due to our many sins, that the hour does need this. Right, in any place and in any community where there are many mosrim, meaning informers against the Jewish community. So, and then he gives examples. Just last week, we got a report from the people of the community of Sharigrad, that one informer has accused the entire Jewish community, and he falsely accused them. Gam Anshe Kilat Kodesh Bar, the city of Bar, right? B-A-R, it's also a city in Ukraine. Shalchu Avur HaMasira de Kal Kadosh Marachavai, right? We'll go back to the map now. I'll show you where these places are. That third one, it took me a little while to identify, but these are the three places. These are, if you see where Lviv is and where Monastritsha is, these three places, Shararad and Murafa, that's Marachvai. If you look at the old Polish spelling, that's what I'm basing this identification on, and the city of Bar. These are in terms of the Polish Empire. This is the Wild East. These are smaller communities. These are more rural communities, and this is closer to where the uprisings broke out. And so he's saying, how come I can't share? Oh, there we are. He's saying that if you look at the things that went on in those places, and in addition, there's so much theft, right? And ganav and gazlan, right? One of them, the difference between a ganav and a gazlan is that one of them commits a non-violent crime and the other one commits a violent crime. A gazlan commits a violent crime. Right, so it's of a piece with murder, right? That's one of the first discussions in Sanhedrin, is that Gazlan is a violent crime. It requires a higher level of justice. Ad-Chadalas, they're innumerable. We can't even count them anymore. There's so much armed robbery, violent crime. Uvitseruf. And if you include in that, Shebekarav Yamim Nirtzach Hashem Nimkom Damo Moshe Chatan Reb Henuch, right? Moshe, the son-in-law of Reb Henuch, was killed, may God avenge his blood, by Yehudi Eglon Shalo, by his Jewish wagon driver. You throw that in also, Imkain Ein Lecha Pirtze Gedol Mizu. The breach is already here. Alkein Yiyeh Hasvara Notenet Ladun Oto Lemita Mishum Migdar Le'avar Ulahaba. So now this does rise to the level of Migdar Milta. And you can put him to death. But then he backtracks. I couldn't bring myself to actually say that this is, put the guy to death. So what did I think we should do? What's the next best? I thought maybe that what we should do is we should amputate a limb, cut off one of his limbs. Chotmo, his nose, lishono, his tongue, or to, cut off one of his hands. This is, he just went real medieval here. That's probably worse for this criminal than death, because then he'll live a life of shame, right? It'll be like, this was in the day before social media shaming. You shamed someone by actually making a visible mark, an indelible mark on their body. So a person, he's okay with death. He's given himself up to death. But he would not, even if he would be willing to die, he wouldn't be willing to have a limb amputated. Okay? And so he discusses this for a little while, but he says, but no. he comes off of this also. Morenu v'Rabbeinu Maharam, olav hashalom hifriz al midah ma'od v'chatav she'na'aseh ma'aseh kazeh v'haya meitzar liYisrael ma'od. So he doesn't disqualify this solution in principle, but he says that they tried it once, and Maharam Lublin wrote about it, and he said that it was bad news. It was terrible. It was terrible for the Jews. The outcome was terrible for the Jews. So I retracted, and I said, no, we need to put him to death. And we can add to that the fact that in this case, nidon vidon biyad ha'arkaot l'zeh shekol ma she'amru haposkim im yesh koach biyadenu de'ein lav l'din im lav l'din hainu biyadayim al yedei Yisrael. So all of this stuff that we said that you can't put someone to death, or you can only in particular circumstances, that's only if a Jew is doing putting to death. Aval me'achar shenitan biyad goyim, since he's already in the hands of non-Jews, erkaot hem she'yasu bo mishpat, let the courts bring him to justice, v'yadenu lo tiyeh bo, and we will not touch him. And so that's what his conclusion is. And then he says one other thing at the end here. He says, he discusses the possibility of ransoming the guy. And he says, don't spend a cent for this guy, except in one circumstance. It says, if to spend money on him because he says he wants to repent, that's a desecration of God's name. Because the non-Jews will say that there is no, somebody could commit murder, somebody can get away with murder, literally. That bloodshed is not considered a sin for the Jews. And then what's going to happen next? A non-Jew will kill a Jew. They won't condemn him because they'll say, listen, the Jews don't punish a Jew who, kills a Jew. Why would we punish a non-Jew who kills a Jew? And he says, I've been yelling and screaming for years, al manhige hador, against the leaders of our generation, right? And this has a contemporary ring. The amputation, not so much. This definitely has a contemporary ring. Manhige hador shekol ganavo chote shebala ma'asar. Anytime that a thief or another sinner goes to jail, uzani shtadlut liftototo. They make every effort to redeem that person from jail. Al yedei shochadim, by bribing officials. This causes an increase of crime, an increase of theft, because everybody does now what they want to do. Rabu pritze hador, and there's more people that are willing to sin and breach norms. And we see so many Jewish robbers now. Don't even spend a penny to keep this guy off of death row. If you want to spend a penny, but if this guy converts and he denies the Jewish faith, because right? Because when people's on death row, when someone's on death row, the priests come and they try to encourage that person to convert, but in order to spare himself, right? That he can get out of his death sentence by converting to Christianity. That's something that I'm really worried about. We need to bribe officials. Like, in order to get the guy off, we don't give him a red cent. But if he's going to convert to Christianity, we bribe officials to make sure that he dies, so that he can't weasel out of his punishment by converting to Christianity. Because if he does that, then that's what's going to happen. Anybody's going to do whatever they want, and then they're going to convert to Christianity, and there will be no punishment. So those are the first two. We have a general agreement between the first two opinions, but the third opinion, another Rav Yosef who's not otherwise identified, he says, he uses a different precedent. He says that if the Gentiles surround a city and say, give us so-and-so, give us Sheva ben Bichri, that's the original case. It depends. If the person that they're demanding is liable, committed a capital crime, then you hand him over. If he didn't, you're not allowed to, and you have to let that person who's being demanded escape. And he says, because there are no witnesses here, even though we know that he killed, but since we wouldn't be able to put him to death, not everybody agrees that he's punishable by death. So we're not allowed to hand him over, meaning we can't give him over to the non-Jewish courts to put him to justice. Okay, a couple of comments before going on to the next case. So first of all, it's worth pointing out that even though this appears in a sefer by Rav Avraham Rappaport called Shelot Utshuvot Eitan HaEzrachi, none of these responsa are actually by Rav Avraham Rappaport. That's actually not terribly uncommon amongst, when we're talking about responsa from the early modern period. We tend to think of responsa as books that are, a collections of responsa that people put together based on their own correspondence. And the truth of the matter is that in the early modern period, it was much more akin to a personal archive. And the amount and the things that you keep in your personal archive are things that you think it's important to keep, even if it's not necessarily something that you wrote. Another thing that we see here is, we're talking about life and death. We're talking about a capital case. And the way that it's handled is, I wouldn't say that it's not handled in-house, because the entire discussion is whether or not this is going to be, should the Jews demand that we keep it in-house? Should we give him over to the Gentiles or keep him in Gentile custody? What we do see is an emergent law. There is no single highest court of Jewish appeals. You have several rabbis in Lvov, and you have rabbis in other communities too, and they're contacted for advice, but they're contacted for, you see that there's an exchange of letters between them. And a lot of times that's how law emerges. It's not emerging as, you have a court and you have a jury and you have a judge, and whatever the court decides, that's what's going to become law. You have a protracted process that takes place over a fairly wide area, with various people offering their opinions. And what they're trying to do is they're not issuing rulings as much as they're trying to persuade. They're offering opinions as to what they think should be done. Now, ultimately, the rabbi of Monastricha, or the community of Monastricha, was going to have to decide what we're going to do. Are we going to put this guy to death, or are we going to let this guy be put to death, or are we going to do something else? But the process by which that happened is very distributed. It's very emergent. I would say that it's still hierarchical, meaning you have a process where people are deferring to who they perceive as being greater rabbis and asking their advice or asking for rulings. But at the end of the day, the rabbis have no real power. The only entity that has real power here, if they choose to wield it, is the Jewish community of Monastricha, because the Jewish communities did have independent power. They did operate a semi-independent legal system. This is the era of what's called the Va'ad Arba Haratzot, the Council of the Four Lands, this quasi-governmental body that regulated Jewish affairs within the Polish and then the Polish-Lithuanian and or the Polish Commonwealth, depending on sometimes they were together, sometimes they were apart. And Jews did have a great deal of autonomy, and they probably could have put someone to death. You see different approaches in terms of, some are thinking, at least one of the poskim is thinking about this question much more technically, and another one is thinking about it as a question of policy, meaning he's looking at demographics, he's looking at statistics on crime, meaning are these things, have we gotten to the point where we need to take action in order to prevent this sort of thing from happening? And those are broader policy concerns that are built into halacha, but policy concerns nonetheless. And then you also see different voices on how the different respondents think about non-Jews, right? In the question you saw, the person says, every time he mentions non-Jews, he says, lahavdil, God forbid we should lump Jews together into the same sentence with non-Jews, right? But in one of the responses, in another one of the last response that we saw, there's a very adversarial picture, right? The case that he brings is a case where, he compares it to a case where a non-Jewish, a Gentile army besieges a Jewish city and demands one person from that city that they're going to put to death. A specific person from that city that they're going to put to death. That's a very adversarial way of framing it. The others the first two responses that we saw on it, things are a lot more complicated than us and them, right? One of them even says that you have a situation here where justice is being brought about by means of the Gentile courts. That the Gentile courts are actually making a Kiddush Hashem here. The Gentile courts, by bringing this awful person to justice, it's a Kiddush Hashem, right? So you have different attitudes, different ways of thinking, even within the various responses of how do we deal with, how do we think about ourselves vis-a-vis the culture around us. Now, again, this is right before the uprisings. This is right before the uprisings of 1648. And you see already that, there was, the second responsum that we saw that says that there was a certain deterioration of Jewish society. You already start to see cracks in the facade. You see that there are things that are, it hadn't gotten, meaning it was about to get a lot worse, but the way that he's describing his generation, it really was not, there was a lot that needed to be improved, right? There are some, very famously, there was a Misha Berach that was composed in the wake of those massacres of 1648, 1649, a Misha Berach on behalf of people who don't talk during davening. And so and it sort of has come down to us that those gezerot, those massacres of Jewish communities in 1648 and 1649 were punishment for things like talking during davening. You see here that there was a lot more going on. I mean, I don't, God forbid, want to say that, talking during davening is not a terrible thing to do. That's, I don't know if there are any pulpit rabbis in the audience. If there are, then definitely don't want to say that talking during davening is, that talking during davening is an awful thing. But we see from these responses that there were some much more awful things going on in Jewish society. Things like violent crime, theft, and even, in this case, murder. The next responsa, and I really think that I'm going to skip the one on machine matzah, even though it's really a wonderful responsum, because that one is entirely translated into English, and I translated it into English. It's not just here, it's also on Sefaria. I translated it for Sefaria, I don't know, 8-9 years ago. And the thing that I really wanted to draw attention to here was that in addition, Rav Shlomo Kluger here we get into a debate between Rav Shlomo Kluger and Rav Yosef Shaul Natanzon, two of the greatest rabbinic luminaries from the 19th century, from the mid-19th century. To give you an idea, the Shaul Umeshiv, Rav Yosef Shaul Natanzon, he wrote more than 3,000 responsa. You could study one responsum of Rav Yosef Shaul Natanzon every day, and it would take you longer to go through his complete works than Daf Yomi takes. He wrote more responsa than there are pages in the Talmud Bavli. And he is one of the greatest, meaning he's one of the most prolific respondents of all times. And Rav Shlomo Kluger is no slouch. One of his svarim, called Halakhah Shlomo, itself contains 1,000, and that was not his only work. It was not his only work of responsa. They were asked about machine matzahs, and one of the interesting things, I want to highlight a couple of things without going through the entire response. And Rav Shlomo Kluger is the one who comes out strongly against it. So he says, and he gives several reasons. So before he even gets started, he says, this is one of these newfangled things that comes from the West. This one of the newfangled things that comes from Ashkenaz. And the question is asked from Krakow, where when you're in Poland, and at this point in the mid-1800s, there was no Poland, but Krakow was always something of a gateway to the east. It was this city that was actually on the border of the three empires in that day. So it's of course going to come to Krakow first. And when it comes to Krakow, the community there is wondering, can we eat this on Pesach? Rav Shlomo Kluger says, well, I heard that this is what they're doing in Germany now, but he says, dinat Ashkenaz ein lahaviraya. You can't bring any proof from what they do in Germany. Those Germans, I just don't trust them. And he's talking about German Jews. He's like, those Yekes, I don't trust them. I don't think they're so serious. Already at that point, the German Jews, even the German Orthodox Jews were seen as, they do things they go walk around, they're clean shaven, I don't know what, these guys aren't so serious. They carry their umbrellas on Shabbat. The fact that they eat machine matzah, that doesn't mean anything to me, right? And then he gives several answers. And then the third answer that he gives, he says that there's a moral aspect to it. Why? He says, because nowadays, there are people, right? Matzah baking is a way to give people, is essentially a form of make work. It's a form of welfare. You're stealing from the poor people because their expectation is that, look, Pesach is an expensive holiday, right? How are you going to afford the hotel in Puerto Rico unless you can go and, bake matzahs and make a couple of extra dollars? I'm just kidding. They weren't going to hotels in Puerto Rico. They were talking about the basic necessity, right? 4 cups of wine and some matzah and maybe a little bit of meat. That was what they were hoping for Pesach. Pesach's an expensive holiday. And one of the ways that they can afford it is that they work for the matzah bakeries. And if you take this away by making it in the machines, right, it's totally a public policy consideration. But it's like people today saying, we don't want electric cars because so many people are going to lose their jobs. So that's the sort of argument that Rav Shlomo Kluger is making, right? If machine matzah is baked, if we bake matzahs with machines, then it's going to be terrible because all these people are going to lose their jobs right before Pesach. And then he says, and this is something that we would expect from someone in this era of, sort of like the beginnings of the early what we call orthodoxy, where there's, where minhag takes on an entirely new valence. Says, Gam, kol minhag Yisrael Torah me olam have matzot agulim, right? The minhag Yisrael, which is Torah, matzah is always round, not square. Now you're going to make the matzah square, right? And obviously you have to make square matzahs because that's, you can't divide it up you can't divide it up well, you can't cut them well if they're circular. And that's why all machine matzahs are square. It's not just, they decided to make them square. They're square, they're not round. He says, and the minhag is that we have round matzahs, not square matzahs. And therefore, we shouldn't change our minhag, and we need to keep our minhag of having round matzahs, which means that we have to have handmade matzahs. Okay, we know what history thought of this, right? Obviously, with the exception of very, very few communities nowadays, the view of Rav Yosef Natanzon, and was by no means the only one that had that view, is that machine matzah is kosher l'Pesach. Machine matzah, you might even, most people think that you can even make it, you use it. Some people think it's even better to use it for the Seder and make the bracha of alachilat matzah, that it has the status of shmura matzah in every sense. It's also worth pointing out that if we could go back to the map for a second, right? So here, Rav Shlomo Kluger and the Shaul Umeshiv, right? So here you have the matzah is in Krakow, much further to the west, and the two principals here, right? Rav Shlomo Kluger is in Brody, and the Shaul Umeshiv, Rav Natanzon, is in Lviv. Now, we haven't really spoken much about Brody, but if we're going to talk about the other capital of Torah in Galicia, or in what's today Ukraine, the other capital would have to be Brody. And it had a very different history from Lviv. Lviv was much more cosmopolitan. Lviv was a much bigger city. Lviv was a much, it was still very, very Jewish, but there were more non-Jews there. Brody was a much, we would say, frummer place and a much more learned place. For a long time, there was an institution that functioned in Brody called the Klois. This was similar to what we call a kollel, but it was an institution that trained rabbinic leadership, and it was a very highly elite institution. Somebody funded it. It was privately funded, and they had rules. They had rules like you were not allowed to leave the building of the Klois between Saturday night and Friday morning, meaning you go home on weekends. Your home could have been 2 blocks away, but you had to sleep on the benches in the Klois. People like the Noda Yehuda and other great luminaries across the generation studied in this Klois. And that sort of gave Brody this reputation of being a much more, and the first response to Chassidut, against Chassidut in the 1700s, the first cherem, the first excommunication against, the first ban on the early Hasidim, and the first ban on the Frankists, a generation before that, were put together in Brody. So we're talking about a smaller community, but one that has a reputation for being much stricter, much more religious, and also much more learned. So it's interesting to see that playing out in this question of Rav Shlomo Kluger being Machmir and Rav Yosef Shaul Natanzon being Mekil on the question of machine matzah, but not to take anything away, but we saw that it's not only questions of being Machmir, right? The last bit about it's Minhag Yisrael that we have around matzah, that's what you would expect. That's already an orthodox, a frum contention. This is the way we've always done it. We're not about to change. Tradition for tradition's sake. But we also saw that he's concerned about people who are going to lose some livelihood because matzah baking is going to be automated, right? It's the robot apocalypse that we're being replaced by the machines. The last sources that I saw, we are not going to get to. The last sources, they are on your sheet. We are not going to get an opportunity to discuss. These are, I didn't actually bring in any, I didn't deal with the actual dilemmas, but what this is it's 4 cases of igun, just 4 cases where a man was killed or a man is suspected of having been killed. What are the circumstances of his death? Who did they collect testimony from? And they really show the interaction between Jewish society and the society, and the society within which they were embedded. And you also see that since this is the later 19th century and on into the beginning of the 20th century, in the case of the Beit Yitzchak, you see that Jews are penetrating further east into the Ukraine. I shared, so you should have, I shared more maps of those, of these responsa. You have these responsa in front of you. You can learn them with a chavruta, and you can take a look at the maps that I shared, which show where these particular responsa and where these respondents, the three respondents in this section, all of whom were active in Galicia in the, until the first decade of the 20th century, until the eve of World War I, they were all, where the communities that they were writing to. And these are communities all over Galicia and beyond into both south into Hungary and north and east into the Russian Empire, which at that time included the bulk of Ukraine. Galicia was obviously part of Austria, but the majority of Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. So I leave you with that to study from, on your own. Thank you. Any questions? I'm going to share here a map that has those three respondents, sort of like a look at where those three respondents wrote their responsa to. And it's a layered map, so you can look at each one independently. You can look at them together. You can also toggle the borders. Right now it's, you can show it with contemporary European borders or with European borders from the early 20th century on the eve of World War I. So up to you. You can play around with it.
Just for clarification, that's the Columbia Library's map?
Yes.
All right.
I made both of these maps. Just it's, the Columbia Libraries is just that's the account. Mm-hmm. The account of that software is through Columbia Libraries.
Rabbi Fischer, it's been a pleasure have you teach here, and to everyone, thank you for joining us and in Parent and Thought. We will have a final session on Thursday with Miss Dahlia Wolfson on the topic of Jewish Ukraine through the eyes of Shalom Aleichem.